Hara looked at Alice with concern and said, "Come here. I want to show you something." Alice had come from a sheltered upbringing. It was time to teach her how to look after herself when around men who didn't know their manners. Hara had given her the knife and now it was time to show her how to use it and other less lethal methods when dealing with a stronger force. Hara wished Alice would be safe in any circumstances, but she knew from experience that wasn't true. Hara reached up to the dragon on her shoulder and tapped a paw and pointed it at the wheel. It chirped and glided from her shoulder to perch on the wheel. Alice asked as she watched the small creature, "It can fly?" Hara glanced back at the dragon and said, "Not really. It can glide a bit. It weighs too much to truly fly. It is a clever creation, but really it is only a novelty. Now let me show you how to use that knife." Alice was still distracted and said, "Are you going to name it?" Hara grinned and said, "I already did. Her name is Angel." Alice brought her attention away from the dragon and said, "That is pretty." "I know. Maybe a little too pretty when Gideon hears." There was amusement in Hara's voice. Alice asked, confused, "Gideon? Why would he not like the name?" "Gideon is an angel's name. It will annoy the heck out of him." Hara enlightened. Alice sighed and shook her head lightly. "I don't know why you and Gideon can't get along. He is a rather nice man." That made Hara interested and asked, "Has Gideon been flirting with you?" "No. You know he is sweet on you, don't you?" Alice asked, confused. "Yeah, and that is part of the problem." Hara didn't want to explore her feelings for the dragon. They, at the very least, were complicated. Alice frowned, but didn't ask any more. Hara couldn't explain that it was all the more complicated because Gideon wasn't everything he seemed to be and she really didn't want hysterical people when they found out that they had a dragon on board. The sooner they dropped him off at home, the better. Hara set the food down and said, "Henry said it is a simple stew, but it smells better than anything I've made." They had the watch and she hadn't done anything to change the schedule. Gideon might annoy her, but he was still good company on watch while everyone else was asleep. Gideon put out some plates. He seemed to not mind doing any servant work. She would have thought the haughty dragon would expect others to wait on him. He pulled out her chair. Angel chirped as she had been sleeping on the chair. Gideon growled at her. But she seemed unperturbed and scuttled to find another place to sleep. Hara eyed the plates and said, "Those are real china. Are you sure you want to use those?" Gideon blinked at her in confusion and said, "They are lovely and you insist this will be our last night together, so I would like to use something that is as lovely as you." "I don't want to argue, Gideon." Hara sighed. He glanced at her. "Who is arguing?" She sat down in the chair he offered. She said, "I just don't want anything to be broken. We are in a moving vehicle. Things can get broken." Hara was nervous, but she couldn't put her finger on why. Gideon said, "We could have this every night, you know." Hara knew he wasn't talking about the nice china or the food. She ate something so she wouldn't say anything. She had dreamed of this when she was younger, but then it had turned bitter when she realized she was destined to end up with someone like her father. After all, everyone said you married someone like your father. The nice dinner every blue moon was not worth the trouble in between. Gideon raised an eyebrow and then chatted about random things. She smiled softly as she ate. She would miss him, and that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "You don't have to be such a baby about it. You are home and it is better that way," Hara said as they dodged people on the street. Angel chirped from her shoulder, mimicking her as closely as she could. Hara had decided with the name Angel the creature was female. Gideon glared at her, but still followed as he continued to argue. "It is you who needs maturity. You fear me and what I will do to change your life, therefore you wish to rid yourself of me. Hara didn't look back as she answered. You are not wrong. He huffed. Then, if you agree you are the juvenile in this situation, why are you making me stay here? She hated he was being logical and said honestly, I need time. Gideon caught her arm and made her turn. He studied her face for a long moment, then said, I do not think so. I spoke to your grandfather and he says you have been traveling for years. You do not need time, you need to face your fears. Hara raised an eyebrow and asked, and you reckon you are the one fear I should face? Yes. He said gleefully. Angel chirped in agreement and Gideon grinned at the small creature. Hara glared at Angel and whispered, traitor. She was tired of this conversation. Let us get to your place and we can talk about this in private. She spun on her heel and continued to dash through the crowds as fast as they would allow her. Gideon said, I am aware you are still going to leave me behind. I have not convinced you. You hide even from yourself and this is not healthy. She threw over her shoulder as she pushed through the crowds. And you don't hide. Alfred told me a little about you. That you don't like dragons and you spend most of your time amongst humans. What are you afraid of? A bit kettle calling the pot black, don't you think? When he didn't answer, she looked over at him. His gold eyes were dark with his emotions. Maybe it would be best to leave this conversation where it was. They arrived at the address she had wheedled out of him earlier. His home was a large building of apartments. Hara was astonished Gideon didn't live in a mansion. She had thought all dragons were rich. After all, he had dropped a fortune on that pirate to buy the airship and he hadn't even blinked. Gideon said, are you going to come up? Hara sighed and took her attention away from the building. Angel chirped, asking as well. The clockwork dragon was fairly easy to understand as she changed the tones of her chirps. Hara said, I'll have to. Otherwise, you will just follow me back and I promised you we would talk. He flashed her a grin and waved for her to lead the way. She said as they entered the elevator. You need to stay away from me. I'm only trouble. So maybe the building was a little more posh than it looked outside. Only rich places could afford to put in elevators. Gideon leant against the wall of the elevator and watched her. Hara tried her best to ignore him. Instead, she asked, what are you going to do now? His gold eyes sparked with interest and she blushed and said, no, I mean when I am gone. He chuckled and said, pine away.